look at Virginia from space at night, something's wrong. The northern edge blazes with light. Millions of people packed into the DC suburbs. Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun County. It's one of the brightest clusters on the entire East Coast. But slide your eyes west into Appalachia and the lights just stop. Entire counties darker than rural Montana. Some places have fewer people per square mile than parts of Wyoming. You'd think this is geography being geography. Mountains are hard, people avoid them. But this divide wasn't natural. It was manufactured. For 400 years, one half of Virginia systematically drained the other. The wealth, the people, the opportunities, all of it flowing in one direction. And the whole thing started with a 100-foot waterfall that trapped an entire colony. If you enjoy videos that dig into the geographic forces shaping America, consider subscribing. The waterfall that decided everything. Here's the thing about that waterfall. It wasn't one waterfall, it was dozens of them, running in a line across the entire state. Geologists call it the fall line. It's one of the most important geographic features on the East Coast, and almost nobody has heard of it. The fall line marks the place where the soft, sandy soil of the coastal plain slams into the hard, ancient rock of the Piedmont. These two geological zones are radically different. One was formed by millions of years of sediment washing down from the mountains. The other is bedrock that's been sitting there since before the dinosaurs. Rivers flowing east toward the Atlantic hit this boundary and drop, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. In Virginia, that drop totals about 100 feet across a series of rapids and waterfalls. And for the first 125 years after English colonists landed at Jamestown in 1607, that 100-foot drop was an impassable wall. Not a wall you could see from a distance, but a wall that stopped every ship that tried to go further inland. Think about what this meant. Ocean-going ships could sail up the James River, the Rappahannock, the Potomac, but only so far. When they hit the fall line, they stopped. The rapids were too shallow, the rocks too jagged, the current too violent. You couldn't drag a cargo ship over a waterfall, you couldn't even portage most goods around it. Not in quantities that made economic sense. So the colonists did the logical thing. They stayed on the navigable side. They built their plantations where ships could reach them directly. Richmond sits right on the fall line of the James River. Fredericksburg sits on the fall line of the Rappahannock. Alexandria sits on the fall line of the Potomac. Every major colonial city in Virginia was built at exactly the point where the water highway ended and you had to stop. This wasn't stubbornness or laziness. It was physics. Tobacco was the cash crop, and tobacco is heavy. Getting it to market meant loading it onto ships bound for England. If you couldn't reach a ship, you couldn't sell your crop. So the Tidewater elite, the wealthy plantation owners who dominated colonial Virginia, built their fortunes on land that had direct access to Chesapeake Bay. They got rich. They built mansions. They controlled the colony's politics. And the land to the west, the mountains and valleys beyond the Blue Ridge, for over a century it sat there, ignored by the English, but not empty. The people who got there first. Here's the twist that most people don't know. Western Virginia wasn't settled by Virginians at all. The people who filled the Shenandoah Valley and pushed into the Appalachian Hollows came from an entirely different direction. While the Tidewater planters were counting their tobacco profits and building Georgian mansions along the James River, a completely different group of people was pouring into the Shenandoah Valley from the north. They were Germans, often called the Pennsylvania Dutch, fleeing religious persecution in Europe. They'd landed in Philadelphia, settled in Pennsylvania, and then found themselves squeezed out as land prices rose and the best farms got claimed. And alongside them were the Scots-Irish, tough Presbyterian farmers who'd been pushed out of Ulster and Northern Ireland and then pushed again out of Pennsylvania when competition got too fierce. Starting in the 1720s, before the English planters had made any serious effort to cross the Blue Ridge, these migrants traveled south on the Great Wagon Road. It was a rough dirt path, barely more than a widened Indian trail, running from Philadelphia down through the Shenandoah Valley and eventually into the Carolina backcountry. Thousands of families made the journey. They weren't looking for tobacco plantations or Tidewater mansions. They were looking for cheap land, religious freedom, and the space to be left alone. And they found it. The Shenandoah Valley had fertile soil, fresh water, and most importantly, almost no English colonists competing for it. The Blue Ridge Mountains weren't just a physical barrier, they were a social one too. Eastern planters rarely crossed them. Why bother? They already had everything they needed on the coast, so Western Virginia developed an entirely different culture. Small family farms instead of sprawling plantations. Subsistence agriculture instead of cash crops. Protestant churches, but not the Anglican establishment that dominated the East. These weren't Virginians who happened to live in the mountains. They were a different people entirely, separated by a wall of rock and a century of divergent history. Two Virginias were forming, and the tension between them would eventually tear the state apart. The slavery question wasn't simple. Now, you might assume that Western Virginia was free territory. The mountains made plantation agriculture impossible, so there was no slavery, right? Not quite. The story is more complicated than that. By 1850, the salt industry around Charleston employed over 3,000 enslaved workers in a single county. Enslaved people labored in coal mines, built railroads, and worked the salt furnaces that produced one of the region's most valuable exports. Across all of Western Virginia, about 18,000 enslaved people lived and worked in 1860. This wasn't a slavery-free zone. But here's what matters. The scale was radically different. In Eastern Virginia, nearly 30% of the population was enslaved. In the West, it was about 4%. That's not a small difference. That's a different world. Eastern Virginia's economy was built on slave labor. Western Virginia's economy was built on family farms and wage work, with slavery playing a supporting role rather than a dominant one. This disparity didn't just create different economies. It created different politics, different values, and different resentments. And those resentments were about to explode. How the East stole from the West. Here's where geography becomes injustice. The wealthy Tidewater elite didn't just control the land along the coast, they controlled Virginia's entire government. The state legislature was designed to favor them. Representation was weighted toward eastern counties. Taxation policy protected slaveholders and large landowners while squeezing small farmers in the mountains. Western Virginians paid taxes that funded roads, turnpikes, and canals. But almost all of that infrastructure was built in the east. The western counties desperately needed better roads. The terrain was rugged, the distances were vast, and without decent transportation, farmers couldn't get their goods to market. But the money kept flowing east. Western taxes subsidized eastern development, while the West got, in the words of one historian, rarely much of anything in return. This wasn't neglect. Neglect is forgetting someone exists. This was extraction, a deliberate system that pumped wealth out of the mountains and into the pockets of coastal elites. The same pattern that would later define Appalachia's relationship with coal companies was already running in the 1700s and 1800s. Take from the West, build in the East, repeat for generations. And the people in the mountains noticed. They noticed for a long time. They just couldn't do anything about it until 1861, the state that broke in half. When Virginia's secession convention voted on whether to leave the Union, the Western delegates voted 32-13 against. They didn't want to secede. They didn't want to fight a war to preserve an institution that barely existed in their region. And most of all, they didn't want to die for the same Eastern elite that had been robbing them for generations. But the East had the votes. Virginia seceded anyway. So the Western delegates did something extraordinary. They organized a counter-convention in Wheeling and voted to secede from Virginia itself. If Virginia was leaving the Union, they were leaving Virginia. 2 years later, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the paperwork creating a brand new state, West Virginia. It was the only time in American history that a state was carved out of another state during wartime. And the region that became West Virginia, along with the mountain counties that stayed in Virginia, was about to pay a terrible price. 632 battles in 4 years. The area that became West Virginia experienced 632 separate military engagements during the Civil War. 632. That's more than any comparable border region in the entire conflict, more per square mile than almost anywhere else in America. Think about what that means. This wasn't one big battle followed by occupation. It wasn't even a handful of major engagements. It was constant, grinding violence, raids, skirmishes, ambushes, reprisals, neighbor killing neighbor for 4 straight years. Some families didn't know from week to week which army would show up at their door. Loyalties were split, even within households. The violence was intimate and endless. Union troops occupied the region until 1869, 4 years after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. And they weren't just fighting Confederate soldiers. They were fighting guerrillas, bushwhackers, and local militias who'd chosen different sides. The war destroyed what little infrastructure existed: roads that had taken decades to build, bridges that connected isolated communities, rail lines that had just started to open the region to trade, mills and forges and warehouses. Anything that could support an economy was a target. So here's the brutal math. Before the war, Western Virginia had been exploited and underdeveloped, systematically drained by the Eastern elite. After the war, it was devastated, physically destroyed. The region entered the post-war era with almost nothing. No capital to invest, no infrastructure to move goods, no institutions to organize recovery. The disadvantage wasn't just locked in. It was cemented into the landscape, but surely something would save them. Surely the mountains held some resource that could rebuild what the war had destroyed. The curse hidden underground. You might think coal should have saved Western Virginia, and for a moment it looked like it would. Starting in the 1850s and accelerating after the war, massive coal deposits were discovered throughout Appalachia. The mountains that had always been a barrier turned out to be hiding one of the largest concentrations of bituminous coal on Earth. By the late 1800s, coal was king. Fortunes were made, staggering fortunes that built mansions in distant cities. Towns sprang up around mine shafts, seemingly overnight. Workers poured in from across the country and around the world. Immigrants from Italy, Poland, Hungary, looking for steady wages in the dark underground. Finally, the mountains had something the world wanted. Finally, the West had leverage. But here's the paradox that economists call the resource curse. Coal made the region poorer, not richer. Coal created a mono-economy. When coal prices were high, the mines hired. When prices dropped, they fired. Sometimes overnight, sometimes thousands of workers at once. There was no backup, no diversification, no alternative industry to absorb the shock. Just boom and bust over and over again for generations. Entire towns would be thriving one year and ghost towns the next. Worse, the wealth didn't stay in Appalachia. Outside corporations, railroads, steel companies, energy conglomerates based in New York and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh bought up the land. They didn't just buy mineral rights, they bought entire mountains. By some estimates, 70 to 90% of Appalachian land became absentee-owned by the early 20th century. The coal companies built company towns where miners lived in company houses, bought from company stores, and went into debt to their employers. The profits flowed out of the region on the same railroad cars that carried the coal. The region got mines, not cities. Jobs, not institutions. Paychecks, not generational wealth. When a mine closed, there was nothing left behind. Just a hollow town, a scarred mountainside, and a hole in the ground. Coal didn't save Western Virginia. Coal trapped it. The numbers that tell the story. Today, the satellite image tells you everything you need to know about who won and who lost. Northern Virginia, the DC suburbs stretching from Arlington to Loudoun County, contains 35% of the state's entire population. Just one corner of one state holds more than a third of its people. Fairfax County alone has over 1.1 million residents. The region produces the bulk of Virginia's tax revenue, drives its economy, attracts its investment, and dominates its politics. When tech companies expand on the East Coast, they look at Northern Virginia. When defense contractors need office space, they build in Northern Virginia. When ambitious young people graduate from college anywhere in the state, they move to Northern Virginia. Meanwhile, the western Appalachian counties are shrinking, and they're shrinking fast. Buchanan County lost 8.4% of its population in just 4 years, from 2020 to 2024. Dickinson County lost 5.1%. Norton City lost 5.9%. These aren't gradual declines measured across decades. They're accelerating collapses happening in real time. The young people leave because they have to. The jobs are in Richmond, in D.C., in the tech corridor along Route 28, and the Dulles Toll Road. There's no choice to make. So they pack up after high school or college and move east, following the same path that wealth and opportunity have traveled for 400 years. The people left behind get older. The median age in rural Appalachian Virginia is 41.3 and climbing. Schools consolidate, hospitals close, main streets go quiet. The same pattern that started with a waterfall in 1607 is still running today, just with different names and different mechanisms. The fall line trapped the colonists on the coast. The Blue Ridge separated two cultures. Political exploitation drained the West. War devastated it. Coal trapped it. And now the modern economy is finishing the job. The strange reversal nobody expected. But something strange is happening. For the first time in over 40 years, some of Virginia's rural counties are gaining population, specifically young adult population. The reason? Remote work. When the pandemic forced millions of Americans to work from home, it accidentally broke one of the oldest rules of economic geography. You have to live where the jobs are. Suddenly, a software developer in Northern Virginia could keep their DC salary while living in a town where houses cost a third as much. Some of them did exactly that. Danville gained population for the first time in decades. Small towns across the Blue Ridge started seeing new faces. Young families fleeing the absurd housing costs of the DC metro area. The pipeline that drained the West for centuries might actually be reversing. But there's a catch. This reversal depends entirely on whether remote work persists. If companies mandate return to office, if the experiment ends and workers get called back to their cubicles, then the window closes. The brief moment when geography stopped mattering will be over, and the old pattern will reassert itself. The mountains aren't going anywhere. The question is whether the internet finally made them irrelevant. Two Virginias, one border. Virginia didn't choose to be divided. The land chose for it. Waterfalls drew the first line, a physical barrier that trapped colonists on the coast for over a century. Different settlers cemented different cultures on either side of the Blue Ridge. Political exploitation drained the West while the East grew wealthy. War devastated the mountains. Coal trapped the survivors in a cycle of extraction that lasted generations. And for 400 years, the pattern repeated. Eastern Virginia got richer. Western Virginia got emptier. The satellite image you see today isn't a snapshot. It's the endpoint of a 400-year chain reaction, each link forged by the one before it. But for the first time, the chain might be breaking. Not because of politics, not because of policy, not because anyone in Richmond finally decided to share the wealth. Because of WIFI, geography wrote Virginia's history. Technology might finally rewrite its future, but only if the connection holds.